What's up, everybody? So this year looks like it's shaping up to be kind of interesting, at least for me. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about Canon's the development announcement of Canon's EOS R5, or what I think the announcement says in terms of what the camera's going to provide, and what we can infer from it. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of my perspective on it. Now, as with my article on the 1D, or my video on the 1DX Mark III, I don't get gear given to me to test, to try out, to do anything with from any of the camera companies. I buy my own gear, which means when I'm looking at a camera and I'm looking at features and I'm talking about my decisions towards buying or not buying the camera, this is coming from somebody who's going to spend their money to buy this camera. So I'm not trying to sugarcoat things because, hey, you should spend money because Canon gave me this cool camera or something like that. That's not what this is about. Additionally, I kind of, as anybody, I come at this thing with, I have my own, you could call it biases or my own perspective on things. I have the way I'm looking at things comes from, my experience, the kind of photography I do, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, obviously, it's not all going to be applicable to everybody else. That's, I guess, where I'm coming from in this perspective. Additionally, I'm going to have to apologize in advance because this is probably going to be a long video. Though may it not be, but I'm going to try to stay rolling along on point with my notes on what I wanted to talk about and not get too far into the weeds talking about random camera stuff. So, what did Canon announce? Canon announced that they're working on the EOS R5 and that it was going to be the most advanced full-frame mirrorless camera ever, or the company's most advanced full-frame mirrorless camera ever, and that they confirmed some very specific details. So it will be able to record video at 8K. It will shoot at 20 frames per second with an electronic shutter. It'll shoot at 12 frames per second with a mechanical shutter. It will have in-body image stabilization. And dual card slots. And so, I mean, in a lot of respects, it's kind of what we were expecting from the rumors, and in a lot of respects, it's a nebulous announcement. I mean, we're working on it, not here's what we've got coming. That said, the announcement does, in some respects, confirm some things that the rumor mill has been talking about. For example, we can expect that it's going to be a 45 megapixel camera. The reason we can expect that is 8K video implies a horizontal resolution of 8,192 pixels, and if you do the math to convert that horizontal resolution to a 3:2 aspect vertical resolution, and then plug that in, multiply them together, you get 44.7 megapixels, so essentially 45 megapixels. I expect it will be rounded to 45 megapixels one way or another, or at least that's how I'm going to talk about it, because 0.3 megapixels just doesn't matter at that point. This does tell us, you'll have to, excuse me for having a drink of water every now and then. As I said, this is going to be a long video and I'm going to be talking a lot. That does have some ramifications, if you will. One of those is that I guess one of the plus sides is we can already look at the performance of the EOS 5DS, lenses on the EOS 5DS, and get a very good idea of how that lens will perform on the EOS R. Now, of course, RF mount lenses, so all those RF, all of the existing RF mount lenses obviously aren't being tested on 50 megapixel cameras right now. And I guess I'm even showing a little bit of my own inherent, I don't know, bias, if you will, in that as interesting as all of the RF mount lenses are right now, and even the announced, the 100 to 500 that Canon announced along the development on along with the EOS R5, which I'm very interested in, and could turn this into a very expensive year if these two cameras come out as good as they possibly could, camera and lens. But as my perspective on the whole thing is basically like, I have a lot of really good EF lenses. I have a 24-70 f2.8 Mark II EF. It's a very good lens. Is the RF lens better? Potentially. It's also $2,400. And so for everything that I have to replace going RF to EF, even if I'm selling the EF, or from EF to RF, even if I'm selling the EF lens to another party, direct person to person, I'm not going to be making, I'm going to be out a substantial amount of money. And so from my perspective right now, the whole RF situation is, and mirrorless situation with Canon is, one, I'm not completely ready to just give up all my DSLRs. I know they're going away. I know I'm moving to mirrorless probably in the next 5 years, but right now, just throw away DSLRs and replace them with mirrorless cameras doesn't seem like the best option for me. Additionally, I have a lot of really good EF glass. Some of it's somewhat old EF glass, but it's still a very solid performing lens, and I don't see a tremendous amount of reason to sort of throw that away too. So, my perspective on the whole lens thing is new lenses in the RF platform that offer capabilities that I need and performance that I need are something that I'd be interested in picking up, but not necessarily replacing the staple EF mount lenses that I use sort of on a daily basis. So like I might look at the 15 to 35 f2.8 with the IS. I have a 16 to 35 f4 IS that I don't use an awful lot, which is kind of why I haven't, that isn't that big of a deal to me. But anyway, that's where I sort of stand with the whole thing, is I'm really looking at camera in terms of working on with my existing glass. So anyway, 45 megapixels. I can jump on any of the lens review sites like the Digital Picture. I can look at how my lenses perform on a 5DS, and I'll have a pretty good idea how they perform on, or will perform on the R5. And fortunately, for the most case, that means very well. The glass that I've invested in in the last few years, and the glass that Canon has been producing in the L series has, by and large, been extremely good quality glass, sort of across the board. They've also announced or confirmed that it's going to support 8K video. And I guess that gives me a point to really jump into video. So, talking about video. Well, wait, before I do that, let's just talk about the still frame rate and whatnot, and how I think that might actually imply, and then we'll come back to video. So 12 frame per second mechanical shutter, 20 frame per second electronic shutter. What remains to be seen is what the frame rates are in conjunction with servo tracking autofocus. So on the EOS R, and I will have to look this one up. So on the EOS R, with servo autofocus enabled, the maximum frame rate is 5 frames per second. Without it, it's 8 frames a second. Does that translate in, or how does that translate, that kind of performance disparity translate to the R5? Now, It's a brand new sensor. Canon says I mean, obviously it has to be a brand new sensor. Canon doesn't have a 45 megapixel sensor. And I suspect one of the biggest limitations in servo tracking autofocus with the EOS R is the fact that it essentially is reusing the sensor from the 5D Mark IV. And when you have the sensor isn't designed for super high speed readout, which is what you essentially need when you're doing imaging and autofocus from the same sensor. So you've got, you know, on a like traditional DSLR, you've got a process that works something to the effect of, you know, mirror goes up, which, you know, that shuts off the autofocus and metering. Shutter opens, camera takes a picture, shutter closes, mirror comes back down. Now, the sensor is being read out by the chip or by the camera at this point in the darkness of being protected by the shutter. But while the mirror's down, the autofocus metering chips are now being able to be used and processed and read. And they have substantially less complexity than reading out, say, the dual pixel sensor logic of a, Canon imaging sensor, a DPAF, a dual pixel imaging sensor. And so while the camera's reading the data, the image, the last image out of the sensor from the previous picture, it's also capable simultaneously, especially in cameras where you have like multiple processors and whatnot, to be driving the autofocus system, figuring out where the focus needs to be, making the adjustments, etc., and taking the next picture. And then, you know, or preparing to take the next picture. And then the camera drives the mirror up, opens the shutter, takes the next exposure. With a mirrorless camera, the sequence of events is obviously quite different. It's the camera has to read out the sensor continuously for the viewfinder. Now, depending on how the sensor is being read, because it's possible that you can read parts of it in dual pixel and parts of it in single pixel, it has to read out the data for the autofocus information, and it can get the metering information from the same picture it's generating for the viewfinder, so that's not really a big deal because that's a parallel task. But you need to have the autofocus information, and you can't just make one measurement necessarily. I mean, you can make few measurements. You don't have to make a lot of measurements potentially, but you need to be able to, you know, make at least a couple of measurements from the autofocus system, part of the sensor, where, you know, where it's doing that to look at the motion of the subject. Because while Sony can kind of, well, Sony even, I can't even say necessarily can kind of get away with it. They have lots of frames per second, and the autofocus system is kind of adjusts. And they have the same problem, though, in like the Alpha 9, the Alpha 7R, and so forth, in that they still need to have at least a few reads from the autofocus point, because they need to know, is the subject speed changing? Because it's, any way you cut it, it's a predictive solution. On a DSLR, it has to predict a lot more. On a mirrorless, it can predict a lot less. But it still needs to be able to predict enough to know that the lens is being driven to the right place. The lens is being driven to the right place when the exposure is being made, and the exposure isn't being made simultaneously with reading the auto exposure or the autofocus information for the exposure. So in the case of the EOS R, I can completely understand why the shooting rate would drop when you're doing the servo autofocus, because the sensor was not really designed to support all of this readout at speed. This new sensor should presumably be able to support that, but we don't know. So it's entirely possible that while it has a 12 frame per second mechanical shutter and a 20 frame per second electronic shutter, that may be without servo focus running. With servo focus running, it may be more like 8 frames per second and 16 frames a second or something like that. I would expect the electronic shutter stuff to still be faster simply because it doesn't have to cycle the mechanical shutter. And of course, the obvious observation here is this is like a serious 1DX3 killer kind of camera. I mean, Canon just announced the 1DX Mark III, 16 frames per second mechanical, or 16 frames per second with the mirror, 30 or 20 frames per second with the in live view mode. That's serious camera, and this is serious 1DX3 kind of killer territory. And it's doing this potentially, you know, let's give Canon the benefit of the doubt, say best case, it's doing this with full servo tracking autofocus. You know, so it's 4 frames a second slower, essentially, with a mechanical shutter compared to the 1DX Mark III. That's pretty serious. And that might sort of draw memories, if you paid attention to the camera industry a little over a decade ago, actually about 12 years ago. Nikon put themselves in a situation with the D3 and the D700 that the D700 was 90% of the D3 at 50% of the cost. And basically the D700 killed sales on the D3. I remember reading multiple stories. Like, I mean, all of the photojournalists that I know who shoot Nikon, they all, I don't know why they all shoot Nikon, but that just happens to be the way it flows out. In fact, most of the people that I know that are photographers shoot Nikon. I'm the oddball Canon guy. But all of the photojournalists that I know that shot Nikon basically turned around and said, we're not buying D3s, even though they were buying D2XSs and so forth before. We're just going to buy D700s because the camera was more than capable of providing the frame rates and resolution capabilities that they needed. And, you know, Nikon did not have a great amount of success with the D3. Great camera, you know, nothing to say bad about the camera, but when you can get 95% of the camera for 50% of the price, well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out where people are going to put their money. And so the question that sort of obviously comes out of that is Canon, like, could Canon have that problem here? And to that, I would respond no. Largely for 2 reasons. First of all, DSLRs are a dead end. The 1DX Mark III is likely the last 1D series DSLR that Canon makes. The next iteration would come in about 4 years, and in about 4 years, I'm pretty sure Canon's probably not going to be doing DSLRs anymore. There are just too many advantages to mirrorless cameras. The biggest being that costs come down substantially because the mirror and all the extra autofocus and metering sensors and the optical viewfinder and the mirror mechanism and the shutter mechanism, they're all complex precision parts that have to be installed in a very precise manner, and that drives a tremendous amount of cost into the product. Get rid of all that, you cut out a lot of cost. Obviously, you know, one way to do that is they can cut out a lot of cost and turn it into pure profit. But the other thing is, more than likely, I expect to see Canon and so on, you know, Canon split the difference. They'll take a little more profit on the cameras and they'll give us a cost reduction for us, which, you know, is a good thing. So a EOS 5D would be $3,500 new, and a 5R maybe $3,000 new or $2,800 new. I would expect it more around $3,000. So we get $500 to pocket, and more than likely Canon gets, you know, a reasonable increase in profit off of the cameras. So undermining the 1DX Mark III this year with a mirrorless camera really doesn't have a long-term effect. The camera was in development. The camera is already, you know, was already coming to market, and quite honestly, for a lot of the professionals that shoot with a 1DX kind of camera, I think there's going to be, or there is a level of needing to demonstrate to them that they can use a mirrorless camera, that a mirrorless camera could do the job. Because in my experience, the kind of sports photographers and action photographers that are dependent, you know, professional level, that are dependent on these kinds of cameras, to do their job are moderately reluctant to upend into a new technology without having some very solid demonstrative proof that that technology can do the job. Certainly I know I would be, because again, my livelihood would be on the line, is on the line. So changing cameras just for the sake of changing cameras is not necessarily something that I see people wanting to do. And so even if the 5R undermines the 1DX, first of all, I expect most of the 1DX Mark III sales that Canon's going to sell are going to be done by the time, in 6 months from now, by the time the 5R comes to market, or 4 months, or whatever it ends up being. I don't have concrete proof on this, but I suspect that the vast majority of sales that happen on that class of camera happen very early in the camera's life, when pros upgrade to these new capabilities, and then sort of the rest of the life of the camera is like replacing broken units, or maybe picking up a second unit or something like that. But I think, like I said, the bigger, more important point for the 5R is if it can handle full servo autofocus and accurate autofocus and do it at 12 frames per second with a mechanical, the 1220 frame per second thing, at a, say, $3,000 price point, I could see a lot of professional sports photographers picking, that shoot Canon, picking one up to play with, and demonstrating to them in a very practical, very economical sense that, yes, mirrorless cameras can replace their DSLRs, and then in 4 years, we won't see potentially a 1DX Mark IV, we'll see a 1R, or we might even see a 1R sooner than that. So I don't really consider the still performance to be, frame rate wise, to be that much of a threat to undermine the rest of Canon's products, largely because this is the way forward. And if it cuts out some sales on 1Ds, is that really a bad thing when it drives people to realize the performance that they can actually have and, get in a mirrorless camera? And certainly it ends up being sort of competitive with Sony. I mean, if I look real quick, the Sony A9 Mark II has a frame rate of up to 20 frames per second. So, at 24 megapixels. So if the R5 can do 20 frames a second with the electronic shutter at, at 45 megapixels, that's kind of really kicking butt. And I don't actually think that that should be a problem, because the second aspect, and this is where we get into talking about video, Canon has confirmed that the camera will do 8K video. And we could make an assumption that that means that it will be able to shoot 8K video at either 24 or 30 frames a second. I don't expect to see 60 frames a second for 8K. Quite honestly, from a practical standpoint, 8K is massively overkill for anything, period, but there's this consumer electronics, I don't even know what to call it, kind of mentality that has sort of slipped into photography and TVs and images, that more resolution is super important and super necessary, and that you have to go up in multiples of 2, so 8K is the next thing that really needs to be done. And now they're going to deliver it, because they've said that's going to be delivered, so it's obviously going to be delivered. I don't think there's any question to that. But, if we assume that they can do it, the camera will do 8K at 24 to 30 frames a second, well, 8K is 35.5 megapixels. Adding 10 megapixels onto that, so a little under 30%, I think, if I'm doing the math correctly in my head, and then dropping the frame rate by, say, from 30 frames a second to 24 frames or 20 frames a second, There should be more than enough bandwidth in the processing environment in the camera and the readouts for the sensor to support doing 8K footage to be able to do 20 frames a second at 45 megapixels. So I think it's potentially possible, or it's reasonable to assume that this is going to be functionally or practical. Again, the big question is going to come back to autofocus. Now, video autofocus is sort of a completely different cup of tea in a sense, because the autofocus demands are different. In a still image, the demand on an autofocus system is to accurately have focus on the subject. In a video system, the demand is to smoothly shift and transition focus when you track, change, or adjust the focus. So it's much more acceptable to read out in video and have the focus sort of lag behind. Not that it necessarily will, but it's much more acceptable and desirable for that to happen when shooting video than to have a whole bunch of out-of-focus stills, because in video, the overall product is what matters from a focusing perspective, how smooth everything works and looks. Whereas in still photography, everything being, or the key things being in focus, the thing that's under the autofocus point being in focus, is the critical point that absolutely matters. So 80 frame or 8K at probably 30 frames a second. And there's some things that we can imply and infer from this. Now, again, none of this has been, other than that it's going to support 8K video. The rest of this stuff I'm inferring. It's not been stated by Canon. I don't have a source on it other than I can crunch math and dump numbers and sort of come to a conclusion on my own. So 8K at 30 frames a second implies that the camera can process at least 1 billion pixels a second, which is a lot of pixels, but it's not an untractable problem at this point in time. A modern camera can certainly process 1 billion pixels a second. A modern processor can do that. But the question ends up really being, when it comes to video side of things, what is the compression going to be? How are they going to handle that? My guess is for 8K footage, it might very well be RAW. RAW. So the deal with compression is it's always a trade-off. You either trade time and power. So computational complexity takes the more computational complex a compression algorithm is, the more time and power it takes to process that for space. Or you trade flinging bits. If you look at the 1D Mark or the 1DX Mark III, 5.5K is RAW. Could they have done 5.5K at H.264 or H.265 and saved some space? Possibly, but to do that would probably imply having a substantially shorter recording time, higher power demands, and so forth. And I mean, I can see this, obviously the camera's going to have hardware to handle the compression for video, which is probably going to be, at this point, I think the safest assumption on what the camera's going to support is, at least for full HD and 1080p, or full HD and 4K, it's probably going to support, similar to the 1DX, H.264 and H.265. At this point in time, I don't see any reason not to support those two codecs, whether they do the same kind of thing, or even just H.265. Obviously, the hardware is available to do it in an embedded environment in real time without completely tanking the power consumption. So I would expect that as a minimum. What they do beyond that is sort of the open question in terms of things. Now, you could certainly find hardware to compress 8K video in H.264 or H.265. I think. I could be wrong. But the problem that we go back to is complexity. And every time you step up, the complexity becomes more and more and more processor or time hungry. And so, I mean, you could see this very clearly if you do any work sort of encoding stuff on, desktop for delivery. 4K files take dramatically longer to compress than 1080p files, and 1080p files take dramatically longer to compress than 480p files. And it all has to do with there's that much more data, there's that much more has to be processed, there's substantially more stuff that has to get done, and that's all power consumption. So, like I said, I would not be surprised to see RAW for the some flavor of RAW for the 8K video. Plus, I think that sits well with, I think, the target market for 8K video. I shoot for YouTube. If I was engaged in, which is a hopeful thing that I might get to eventually, but if I was engaged in shooting sort of productions for small businesses, I'm not shooting 8K. YouTube, I'm not delivering 8K footage. I'm not even delivering 4K footage to YouTube right now for a number of reasons, and I don't even want to shoot in 4K for a lot of things for a number of reasons, none the least of which being it takes up a tremendous amount of space. Even ignoring Canon's 500 megabit 4K compression or 4K format that I have on the 5D Mark IV, at 100 megabit, it still takes up 3 times as much space as what I'm shooting in 1080p. And, the reality is, when you look at TVs and viewing and so forth, there are diminishing returns. The vast majority of TVs in people's houses that I know, regardless of how big they are, don't need to be 4K. They sit so far from the TV that the TV, the benefit of having the 4K resolution is completely lost because their eyes can't resolve more than 1080p or even 720p. It is not, you do not have to get very far from a TV before the 4K is essentially just not relevant. But for the market that right now that I think would be most interested in 4K, which would be sort of Hollywood, the really professional high-end visual effects laden kind of markets, which I don't know how, or television production, I don't know how keen they would be on like jumping on this camera to use for that kind of shooting, but RAW for them is a boon. It's more data to work with, and they have the budget and the resources to deal with storing all of that extra information. So, I mean, I expect to see, average people buying the camera shooting in 8K because, wow, 8K. But when you stop and you look, I think this is what frustrates so many people, like in the Canon rumor community, if you will, is that Canon tends to be, you could say conservative, but they also tend to think about what they're doing. They aren't, people get angry at them because they're not delivering this great, the product they want, but oftentimes the product that people are sort of asking for is kind of, an insanity point. You're not going to shoot a TV commercial in 8K. There's no point in doing it. And I mean, especially for anything short of a major, like Super Bowl level production, there's no point in doing it. It's not going to get broadcast in 8K. It's just, you're wasting space because, well, 8K, I guess, or something like that. But anyway, I think RAW fits well with that. It makes it computationally less demanding on the camera, and it provides sort of the thing that I think people that really need 8K now to shoot would actually use. That said, if there was one thing, and this complaint goes back, I could assess this at the 1DX Mark III, I would like to see sort of multiple options. Like on the 1DX Mark III, you can't shoot 4K in RAW or 1080p in RAW. I would like to potentially see that just on the grounds that like, you know, maybe I need could use the extra information, but not a file size that's being recorded at 2.8 or 2.6 gigabits a second. I mean, that's 375 megabytes a second. That fills a card almost, you know, like ridiculously. I mean, 500 megabits fills a card so fast that it's hard for me to wrap my head around. But, you know, 375 megabytes a second is like you're going through a gigabyte every 3 seconds. That's a tremendous amount of data to deal with. Speaking of which, actually, let me jump back a second, because I just thought of this and I didn't have it in my notes. Configuration options. I was talking about the mechanical, or the shutters, the high continuous high frame rates. In the past, Canon has only had frame rate controls in the 1D series cameras, so the 1D, the 1DS, the 1DX now, where you could specify the upper limit for the frame rate in continuous low and continuous high, which wasn't a tremendous problem, because when you got to a camera like the 5D Mark IV, your continuous high is around 7 frames a second, your continuous low is about half of that, it's like 3.5 frames a second, and that's a reasonable split in terms of performance. Now we're talking about a mirrorless camera with 1DX frame rate capabilities, and with that, I feel that it's pretty important to have the ability to tune that to what you need. I might want continuous low to not be 3 frames a second while continuous high is 20. Or I might not want continuous low to be 10 frames a second while continuous high is 20. Like, you know, again, we're talking a 45 megapixel image. It's going to be at least a 14-bit file. You know, that's beefy. Anybody who shoots with has shot with a 5DS or a Nikon D850 or Z7, you know, they'll know the files get big. You burn through a lot of storage fairly quickly, and being able to tune your frame rate to your needs and your sort of storage allowances is not necessarily, you know, it's kind of becomes more important when you start talking about 10 frames a second, 12 frames a second, especially 20 frames a second. So going back to video, one thing we can infer potentially from 1080 or at 8K footage being shot at 30 frames a second is that the camera would have the processing power to do 4K at least 60 frames a second, if not 120 frames a second. And, you know, obviously 1080p at least 120 frames a second, if not potentially 240 frames a second. I don't really think we can expect to see 240 frames a second in the camera. I think that's a little too niche for a mirrorless from Canon. It would be nice to have. I mean, both being able to shoot both 1080p and 4K at 120 frames a second is something that I would really like to have, just for B-roll, for, you know, that kind of thing. The slow motion effect is a really nice sort of feature to have. But I'm doubtful we'd see that, even though, at least from a pixels per second perspective, it would be possible, although there would be more questions about, like, how the actual sensor readout speeds and so forth. That would be the bigger dictating factor. So this brings me to sort of the last point. And in my opinion, this is the biggest factor for me, which is the body, the ergonomics, and the user interface. Over Christmas, Canon, and I should point out, like I said, I'm not, like, flailing on the mirrorless bandwagon, and I'm not, like, stuck in the DSLR world where I don't want to leave it. I want to make a jump, but I want to make a jump that makes sense. I don't want to give up a lot of features. I don't want to, you know, flip over just for the sake of flipping over. To me, it's all about getting a tool that does what I want to do, or lets me do what I want to do the best that I can do it with. And that has some implications, in fact, more implications for me in terms of user interface than necessarily frames per second or resolution or things like that. So the picture that Canon has presented of the R5 makes it look a lot like an EOS R. And I'm not really sure that's a great thing. I'm a little uncomfortable with that, I think I should say. Now, I should say I don't have any practical experience shooting with an EOS R from a user interface standpoint. Canon had them on sale in December for, I could have got one for like $1,200, which, I thought about long and hard, and then I said no, because it's a step back in terms of capabilities or of features from my 5D Mark IV. It's a 2 frame per second loss of frame rate for shooting wildlife and, with servo AF. It doesn't have the dual rear button autofocusing capability that the 5D Mark IV has. I mean, yes, you can do rear button focusing, but you can't have 2 buttons that independently do registered, autofocus point and primary autofocus point, or with different patterns or whatnot. And that's something that's become sort of a substantial part of my camera user experience. And so this is probably the biggest point that concerns me when it comes to the EOS Rs and especially the R5. Now, the Canon camera was announced as being in development with a release, my understanding, reading the press release of this year. That obviously could potentially mean that there's a couple of body options in flux and, they need to pick one or whatever. But on the same token, they're also saying they're going to be showing the camera at WPPI, or I think that's the event, at the end of this month. And therefore, they have to have something already pretty much settled on. And there's a lot of things when it comes to Canon camera interfaces that sort of, I don't understand where they've gone with it. It's like they have a great interface physically on their DSLRs, and now with the mirrorless cameras, it's kind of like, well, let's throw this out and do something different, and it's sort of for the sake of, I think, doing something different. So there's a number of things that I don't quite understand the value of. So, and this is where this discussion actually gets quite complicated, and I may end up having to make sort of more videos talking about user interfaces or whatnot. But, for example, one of the big changes that prominent things you can see in the R5 pictures and in the EOS R is there's a great big power switch. Why do you need a great big power switch on a camera? On the 5D Mark IV, the power switch is a little tiny, it's a relatively small thing behind the mode dial or under the mode dial. On even the EOS M5, the power switch is just a little toggle on the camera under the mode dial. And having a mode dial that sits on the top left side of the camera is sort of a perfectly acceptable place to put a mode dial. So if you've spent any time looking at user interface design, you've probably come across Fitz's law. And I, for a long time, thought this had something to do with computers or something like that. But when I dug into it, Fitz was actually, I think he was a major or a colonel in the U.S. Air Force in the 1950s. He was a psychologist. And his focus was looking at human-machine interaction, trying to figure out why planes crashed or what was going on in plane crashes. And in that time, in the 40s, the 50s, back in that time, the engineers building the planes didn't put a lot of consideration to, like, how to lay out controls for usability. They put controls either where they were convenient or where they thought it should go without necessarily having a pilot say, no, in the case of an emergency, this is something that's really important and needs to be prominent and easy to access. And so Fitz puts out an objective metric to basically rate the accessibility of a control based on its size and how far you have to move to access it. And so you can then sort of take Fitz's law and you can take sort of the controls you need to use to work a camera to take a picture and rank the controls you need to use to work a camera to take a picture in order of importance, in order of frequency of access, and then apply Fitz's law to those controls. And so, like, if we take a 5D, what do you do a lot? Shutter release, right under your index finger on your right hand. Now, I apologize, left-handers out there, they don't make left-handed cameras. I'm sure you guys can get along reasonably well with this, but, you know, for the vast majority of people, their right dominant hand is their right hand. So the right index finger is the finger they have the most control over, and it has the most sort of precision. And so putting the shutter release there makes sense in the general case. It's the control you most efficiently reach or can have your finger on. Conversely, what's a shooting control you don't really use an awful lot? The mode dial. I don't change, and I don't think I'm all that odd in this case. I don't change from shutter priority to aperture priority all that frequently. I may do it at the beginning of a shoot, but I'm not doing it under time pressure, and I'm not doing it when, you know, every other frame. So having the mode dial over here on the top left of the camera where it's kind of out of the way, but you're not going like this constantly, makes it's a good place for an infrequently used control. And this has always been sort of a criticism I've had of Nikon cameras, in that they put controls places, but they put things sort of in prime real estate. So like this area here, behind the shutter release on the top plate on the right side of the camera, you can easily say is prime real estate. And it's objectively prime real estate because your finger is right here when you're shooting, and you can just reach back and hit any of these buttons and get to these buttons. And so what did Nikon put there? The button to change what mode, the exposure mode or auto exposure mode the camera was in. Doesn't make a lot of sense when you have things like, you know, with digital cameras, we can change the ISO with every frame. You know, that's a useful control to have. It's a useful control to have flash exposure compensation near there, so you don't like have to reach up and mess with the flash. You can just do it from the camera. It's useful to have the drive mode, the autofocus mode, the you know, white balance mode, you know, settings, and the metering settings potentially even, although like white balance and metering probably get used less than, say, the drive autofocus modes. And if you look at, and I'll put a cutout away of this, if you look at the top plate of the Canon 5D, they put the ISO button where it's real easy to reach. They put the drive AF button where it's a little bit more out of the way, and then they put the white balance and metering button where it's a little bit more of a reach, but all of them are relatively accessible or fairly easily accessible from the shooting position with your finger, your shooting grip on the camera. So what does Canon do on the EOS Rs? Well, they've gotten rid of almost all of those buttons. There's a MF multifunction button, there's a movie record button, which, and this is even carried into their picture of the R5. Maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm weird in thinking this, but when I'm shooting video, the flip the camera into video mode the way a 5D sort of forces you to do it, and separates the whole like video from stills thing makes sense to me, because there's other considerations that I have to take into account when I'm shooting video. You know, external necessarily to the camera, like setting up audio and so on and so forth. And so flipping into a video mode is not really a problem to me. Now, you can make the argument, well, it's a mirrorless camera, it doesn't have to flip the mirror up, you are always kind of in video mode. And I would make the counter argument that that's sort of the problem I keep running into with these, the EOS Ms. This is an M5, but I also have an M3. And both the M5 and the M3 kind of work on the, it's always in video mode, but it's always in stills mode. And you don't get a very clean separation of functionality. Your quick control menu always has to have video stuff in it because you need to be able to change the frame rate. That isn't really important when you're shooting stills. And so it's just clutter that you don't need to have in a still, you know, in the still side of the camera. And having that flip a switch toggle setting gives you sort of, gives me at least sort of a clear mental separation. I'm now shooting video. I have to think like a videographer. I have to think about controlling how I'm moving the camera. I have to think about that kind of stuff. It's not just hit the button and record. And at least at a higher level, I think that's an important sort of thought process or distinction that you have to make when it comes to interacting with the camera. And so that's one of the buttons Canon has put on the top plate near the shutter release in what I call prime real estate. And this is where I get concerned, because granted, not having shot with an EOS R or used an EOS R extensively, I can't be 100% certain that my concerns as a DSLR user translate to the new system. There are new controls. There's the touch, or the touch bar, which I'm not a huge fan of, because I'm not a huge fan of touch controls on cameras that I have to use when I'm wearing gloves. There's the new control ring on the lenses, which I am kind of a fan of, but I wonder about its utility in the bigger sense too. You know, it's a new control ring, but it's not necessarily a consistently located. It's certainly not consistently located if you're adapting EF glass, but that's less of a you know, major issue compared to you know, or that's not much of a major issue. But there's a number of sort of these kind of changes on the EOS R that, for the EOS R, I don't really consider to be as much of an issue, because I don't consider the EOS R to be a real professional camera. It may use the same sensor as the 5D Mark IV, and there may be, you know, there's certainly professional photographers out there that are using the EOS R as their, you know, main camera. Peter McKinnon on YouTube is a perfect example. He sort of switched to the EOS R because it's smaller and lighter and it gives great images and da-da-da-da-da. And, like, there's nothing wrong with that. But when I look at the interface of the EOS R and I look at the interface, the physical control interface of my 5D Mark IVs, I can't help but find myself going, it's lacking features. It's lacking controls. It's lacking the same kind of well thought out, honed over years and years and years of development thought process. It's sort of like, in a way, and this is kind of my concern, that Canon's engineers went, well, it's mirrorless, we'll just do it differently. And to me, it doesn't really work that way, because I still need to change the ISO. I use auto ISO a lot on my 5D, but being able to drop out of auto ISO and actually change the ISO in a controlled manner and shoot at a specific ISO is something I still do fairly regularly. I need to, like, the dual rear button autofocusing that I keep harping on about. That's a big thing. I don't know how many people use it because it's kind of a long, tedious, or a long, convoluted process to get it configured. But for me, the ability to go from a single point, it's say serve or spot or a single AF point in one shot mode to tracking using the entire thing, the entire autofocus area in servo mode just by moving my finger from a button is kind of a big deal when it comes to sort of the subject matter I shoot. I don't want the camera guessing at which bear or which bird, or the bird not necessarily something like the tree that I want in focus. And I don't want the camera like guessing when it should transition on focus. Like, just because the camera's mirrorless, the utility of that functionality hasn't gone away. I'd almost argue in some respects that the utility of like dual rear button focusing is actually improved or increased, because you start talking about like an EOS R, R5, whatever. The whole sensor is effectively the autofocus field. There's a ton more autofocus points. There's a ton more sort of difficulty in moving from like one side to the other of the field to, as you adjust compositions, that should still be there. And sort of my concern is that as Canon has gone, well, we're going to make the camera cleaner, I think, they've also thrown out a lot of this usability stuff that to me is very important compared to, like I said, just being able to shoot 12 frames a second. So where do I sit on this? I guess this is sort of the question. So had this announcement been the actual announcement and not a look at we're developing this camera announcement, and had it had more details, I was prepared essentially to pre-order the camera. I don't like pre-ordering cameras because in general it's not necessarily the best way to go about things. But my concern looking at, and this still stands, even though they've only done this pre-order or development announcement, they haven't announced all of the features. But between the 8K video and the 20 frame per second electronic shutter and Canon's dual pixel autofocus, which is by far, I think, the best autofocus technology that exists in the camera industry right now. Not to say that somebody won't come out with something better, but it not having to interpolate around autofocus pixels or have massive, like Sony and Nikon have to, or having a massive library or a built-in library of the lenses that Panasonic's focus from defocus technology, which, I mean, it's a clever and impressive technology, but it has its cons in terms of not being able to just switch lenses and have, something that isn't necessarily profiled in the system. So, where do I sit on this? Well, I'm probably going to pre-order the camera. Looking at even though I don't care one bit about 8K, and I would have been more than happy not to be buying a 45 megapixel camera, I think that this has the performance characteristics. Now, granted, we haven't seen the actual performance of the camera, so I reserve judgment, obviously until it's announced, until whatnot. But in looking at what Canon's announcing and what Canon's saying they're going to deliver, and I have very little reason to doubt that Canon can deliver what they're saying they're going to deliver, especially, like I said, if they're going to be delivering it even later this year. All of the major R&D work is done. All of the sensor is designed, the sensor's been tested, the processor's finished, or at least has tapped out to the point that it's been tested and whatnot. It's probably going to be sort of the same Digic X processor that's in the 1DX or something in a similar vein. So right now it's fine-tuning right now the engineering process for Canon should be fine-tuning the last details, fine-tuning the software, working out any remaining bugs, maybe fine-tuning the body design, because that's something that potentially could be, tweaked up, till sort of the last minute, and starting to look at scaling production. But they're not doing a tremendous amount of engineering at this point. If the camera, let's just say, Canon rumors suggested that the camera would be released or released in July or June or July. Let's say July, 6 months from now. For that to happen, it's going to be announced probably, formally announced in 3 months. They'll give them 3 months from the announcement to date to delivery. That last 3 months is a complete loss in terms of any kind of changes or development. So that's all just production and stockpiling and logistics, getting things out, getting things manufactured, getting things done. So they basically have from now until when they formally announce the camera to finalize anything that's still up in the air. And honestly, I don't think there's a ton that's really still up in the air. I don't think we're going to see a major change in the design of the body. I don't think we're going to see a major change in the controls, etc. So whatever they show at the end of this month in person is probably going to be very close to what they actually deliver in later this year. So even with that said, when Canon released the 5D Mark II, I remember watching it go out of stock everywhere because it was this massive change to photography and videography. And even though as a stills camera, it was, I would say, kind of mediocre, as a video camera, it was a completely revolutionary thing. Now, we're not in completely revolutionary territory anymore. Video and stills cameras is a thing, it's been a thing, it's going to be a thing, it's not going away. But 8K in a potentially $3,000-ish, $3,000 to $4,000 camera is kind of a big deal. And it's the kind of thing where I could see the camera going out of stock for a long period of time while Canon tries to keep up with or make up with the, meet the demand. And sort of in general, and again, I'm speculating here, but I can't see Canon's dynamic range decreasing. I can't see the noise performance dropping. Canon's got this figured out on new sensors that aren't kind of rehashes of old technology. They're delivering essentially performance that's on par with the rest of the industry. It's not like they don't understand the importance of this, but I expect to see a phenomenally good performing still camera. My concern sort of as someone buying it is, and this is sort of the big point for me, how much does it offer me as a photographer if I'm giving up things like dual rear button autofocusing? How much is that an issue? How much is the user interface going to be an issue? Touch bar, that kind of thing. How flaky is that going to be? And I certainly don't intend to replace my 5Ds with just sell 5Ds, buy these, that's it, I'm done. This is something that I think, even as a, I'm looking to move in that direction because I know that's the direction sort of everything reasonable is going to be moving. I'm sort of still looking at it as, possibly get one, use it as much as I can, and then see where things fall. Now, the other big factor for me is the 100 to 500 RF. Granted, it's an f4.5 to 7.1 lens, which I know there's going to be people out there whinging about 7.1 and whatnot, but I've been looking to go longer than my 100 to 400. I want to go to a 500 or a 600. I shot with a 600 f2 when I was in Yellowstone 2 years ago, and it was, the problem I ran into with the 600 was it was just heavy. Canon solved that with the Mark III. The problem with the Mark III is I don't trust that it's not going to have serious reliability issues due to its design. Now, I haven't seen a tremendous amount of serious reliability issues, but even ignoring that, it's still big, it's still comparatively heavy, and it's still stupidly expensive. But 100 to 500, even at f7.1, that I can get behind. Because right now, a lot of the times, I'm shooting my 100 to 400 with a 1.4 teleconverter, which is a 560 at f8. So would be giving up 60 millimeters of angle of view, focal length, but I'd also be getting a third stop of aperture pack. So I'd be a 500, a 500 at 7.1. But you can put a teleconverter on it. And this is where the R's, I think, really shine, in that the autofocus isn't inherently limited the way it is on a 5D DSLR. They can autofocus. Canon advertises with the EOS R that it can autofocus at f11, but there's no practical reason that it can't autofocus even further than, with apertures even smaller than that. And because it's being done in the sensor and essentially can fall back to contrast-based autofocus if it has to, if the dual pixel phase information is insufficient. But small light lens, which is what a 500 100 to 500 4.5 to 7.1 is going to be, is sort of right up my alley. And you stick there's no reason that you couldn't put, Canon announced along with it that there's going to 1.4 and a 2x teleconverter. There's no reason that a 1.4 and a 2x, I thought maybe it, for some reason, could have been something else. But there's no reason that you couldn't put a 2x teleconverter on a 4.5 to 7.1 lens on a mirrorless camera like the EOS R. And get usable pictures out of it. And that's the kicker, because on this camera, the 5D Mark IV, I'm perfectly capable or perfectly happy shooting it up to ISO 12,800 and making prints. Fine art quality kind of prints. I no longer, the high ISO capabilities of the 5D Mark IV put me in a position where I no longer sit there and worry, oh, I can't shoot this at ISO 1600 or ISO 3200. Would I prefer not to shoot them at 1600 or 3200? Yeah, I would. I would prefer to shoot them at, a lower ISO, or shoot at a lower ISO. But I know that that camera can deliver 13 by 19 A3 plus prints or bigger at 6400, or potentially even 10,000 or 12,800. And I expect that the EOS R5 will be a step forward in that direction too. At least not a step back. And in fact, even if it's sort of on par, the higher resolution makes the noise finer, it will preserve more, or should preserve more detail, and it should make the camera that much more effective at those high ISOs. So a 100 to 500 at 7.1 doesn't really bother me. And I know that I probably will have sticking a 1.4 or a 2x teleconverter on there and a 3-ish pound, 4-ish pound. I mean, it's not going to be 12 or 13 pounds, even 5 pound, but a 3 to 5 pound 1,000 millimeter lens, even if it's running at f14, potentially with autofocus, which should be something that's entirely feasible on a mirrorless camera, is a fantastic lightweight portable tool, and it's very much right up my alley. And in a lot of respects, it very much solves the problem that I've been struggling with over the last year, which is I want something longer than my 100 to 400. I don't want a 600, and the 500's still big, and both the 500 f4 and 600 f4 are ridiculously expensive. So, like I said, I'm really excited about this, and I haven't gotten excited about a camera since I think the 5D Mark II or 3, the 5D Mark III. So like, I jumped to the 5D Mark IV. I bought 2 of them. You know, they're great cameras. I like them, but they're not, whoa, I have to upgrade kind of cameras. They were in many respects very much have to upgrades for me, but I wasn't really stoked about possibly, you know, when I was going to get one, or how quickly could I get one, or did I want to pre-order the camera. And this camera, I'm excited about. I'm still a little cautious about with respect to, you know, what the actual feature set looks like, but I'm actually excited about it. And so, you know, I guess that's where I stand on the EOS R5. Certainly we'll be talking about this again in the future, because there will be an announcement and there will be a camera, and there's a good chance that I will possibly be doing an unboxing video, like when they go on sale and I manage to buy one, you know, etc. But, and obviously when that happens, I'll have a whole ton of content talking about like usability and, you know, performance and so on and so forth. But for the time being, EOS R5, it looks like Canon could be delivering a really massively capable mirrorless camera this year, possibly not that far into the future. So I know this has been long. I appreciate it if you stuck through the whole thing. I've tried my best to sort of keep this on point and edit it down into the things that I think were most critical. But again, it's been long. I apologize. I'd like to thank you for sticking around. If you found this video interesting or informative, please smash that like button. If you'd like to see more content on cameras, camera gear, photography, video, my struggles learning how to shoot video, and camera tech tips and so forth, please subscribe to the channel. It would be greatly appreciated. I also have similar content to what I'm doing on this channel in written form on my website at pointsinfocus.com. So if that sounds like something that would be interesting to you, or you want to like learn about sort of like what gear you might want to take if you're going to Death Valley or Alaska on a cruise, I have some articles on that, so please consider checking that out. And as I said, thanks for watching, and see you next time.